From the Graduate Management Admission Council, this is Inside the GMAT. When you think about applying to business school, what comes to mind? Probably polishing your resume to perfection, cramming for tests, or obsessing over every decimal point of your GPA. But what if I told you there's more to your application than just those numbers? Today, I'm joined by Petia Whitmore from My MBA Path, a seasoned expert who's seen thousands of applications cross her desk. Petia refers to those traditional application elements, your test scores, GPA, work history, as statistics. And yes, they matter. With more than 16 years of experience in admissions and admissions consulting, she knows these quantitative aspects are crucial. But here's the twist. Petia believes the real magic happens beyond those numbers. There are intangible qualities that can transform a good application into an extraordinary one. The kind that stops admissions directors in their tracks and makes them take notice. So if you're dreaming of business school, lean in. We're about to dive deep into the art and science of crafting an application that truly tells your unique MBA story.
I am so excited to be here, Zach. So I am a former Dean of MBA Admissions, and these days you can say that I've kind of changed sides. I've gone from being a gatekeeper to being a gate opener. So I help MBA hopefuls stop guessing what top schools want to hear and see in their MBA applications and understanding how to put together an application that significantly increases their odds of getting admitted.
I love that. A gate opener. That's great. That's what I want to do today. Can you walk us through what that typical evaluation process looks like for an MBA application, sort of from start to finish, from a distance?
From a distance, let's do it. And I think it's a great place to start because let me first tell you how candidates think that it works. This is what they think happens. They assume that they kind of lay out their statistics, they lay out their work experience, they talk about their extracurriculars, and they assume that someone somewhere evaluates their profile and decides if they should be admitted or denied. And that's not how it works. The MBA application process actually has two distinct phases, evaluation and selection. So evaluation is the first pass. It's when an admissions reader reviews your application and asks, does this person meet the qualifications to thrive in our program? They look at your academics, test scores, your professional track record, your engagement outside of work or school. But here's the thing. Many applicants pass this phase. That might surprise people, but for top MBA programs, a very huge part of the pool is actually qualified. I like to very often point candidates to the website of the Wharton School because they've actually answered this question. It's in black and white right on their website. And it literally says, I'm quoting, we typically receive 6,000 to 7,000 applications in a given year. And approximately, hang on to your seat, 75 to 80% of all applicants are qualified for admission. When I show this to candidates, they're like literally stunned. And that's when I have to educate them on the difference between evaluation and selection. So selection is where it gets real. Once the candidates have been interviewed, and we're going to go into that later, the committee is making intentional, deliberate choices about who they want in the class from all of these well-qualified people. Think about it this way. Evaluation determines who's admissible. Selection determines who's desirable. So at this stage, it's not just about checking boxes. It's about crafting a class. Schools could literally fill their classes twice over without sacrificing quality or class profiles one bit. But they don't just admit everyone who qualifies. They choose the people who make the class better, more interesting, more dynamic. The most important point here for MBA candidates is that it's not a decision solely about the individual candidate. It happens in the context of a larger applicant pool, which is the very reason why the top MBA programs have admissions rounds. They want to compare and contrast a large group of qualified candidates and pick the ones they want. So that's where an MBA candidate's story, their true story, the leadership impact, the unique point of view comes into play. Because at the end of the day, no one gets admitted because they deserve a spot. They get admitted because they make the class stronger.
It's very helpful framing, right? For somebody who maybe is not familiar with the process, has assumptions about the process. And something that you mentioned were committees. What is a committee? I mean, how many people make up a committee? That's also sort of a black box or a scary sort of buzzword during this application process.
Absolutely. So an admissions committee, or as candidates lovingly call it, AdCom, is essentially a group of individuals which comprises admissions professionals. Sometimes there are faculty on an admissions committee. There could be external readers. And these are all people who in some way are involved in the evaluation and selection process. You might sometimes have a broader group involved in the evaluation because, again, you can have external readers that the schools train and prepare to read and evaluate applications. You might even have current students or alumni be involved in interviewing. So they're kind of getting and providing input. But then when it comes to decision making, so the selection, it's usually really a much smaller group, the leadership of the admissions office. Sometimes there could be an academic representation, but most often it's just the admissions staff. So that's broadly who's on an admissions committee.
And it sounds like it's not standardized from school to school.
It's not. It can vary from school to school. It can even vary from program to program within a school. When I was Dean of Admissions at Babson College, I would have different compositions of my admissions committee, say for my full-time MBA program versus my part-time MBA program versus maybe my specialized master's. So it does vary. The level of academic involvement might vary. The process might vary. It's not standardized.
Got it. Okay. Now I want to step into the gate a little bit more. What are some of those, let's call them non-quantitative factors that make the biggest impact in an application? So I don't want to talk about test scores. I don't want to talk about resumes. What are some of those non-quantitative, maybe even non-tangible factors that somebody should be cultivating, considering, thinking about when they begin this process?
So numbers get you in the door. They're kind of like table stakes, right? But they don't get you an invitation to stay. So the real differentiators in an application are about something much bigger than numbers. And I usually talk about the 3 pillars of a strong application, and I call them clarity of purpose, demonstrated impact, and authenticity. When I talk about clarity of purpose, schools are not simply looking to hand out MBA degrees for people who are exploring options or trying to figure it out. You need to be able to answer 3 questions with confidence because you're going to be asked these 3 questions, most likely in the application itself and also in the interview. And these questions are, why do you need an MBA? Why now? And why this school? And I can tell you that the number of MBA candidates who stumble on these questions is way higher than you might think. So let's just say that someone has been working in consulting for 4 years and they say that they want to transition into tech. Okay, but why do you need an MBA for that? Tech companies hire previous consultants quite frequently. So what are you missing? I used to call it sometimes, what is it that you don't have or you don't have enough of it in your skills and experience that an MBA will give you? Or maybe you're in finance and you want to go into impact investing. Great. But why now? What changed in your work, in your industry, or even in your ambitions that makes this the moment to go back to school? And then there's the big one. Why this school? The weakest answers here are when candidates give responses that can apply to any top program. So if your essay says, I want to develop my leadership skills and gain a global perspective, which are 2 completely valid reasons to want an MBA, but if you state them this way, I want to develop my leadership skills and gain global perspective, congratulations. That can be Harvard, that can be Wharton, that can be INSEAD or a dozen of other places. So you need to be specific. What is it about this school's curriculum, community, the culture that makes it the right place for you. When an admissions officer reads an application, they should be thinking, this person is clearly meant to be here. From there, if we go to impact, demonstrated impact, and let me just make a small detour here, because candidates very often think that you need a prestigious employer on your resume, that's what impact is all about. So let's be clear, like schools don't admit companies, they admit people. So the question then becomes, how have you left a mark? Have you changed something, led something, built something? And this doesn't mean that it has to be a major initiative, a billion-dollar launch. Impact comes in all sizes, and sometimes the smallest ones can be the most touching stories. Maybe if you spearheaded an internal mentorship program that helped increase retention on your small team. Or maybe you led a project that streamlined operations and saved maybe $25,000. It doesn't have to be a massive amount. So whatever it is, they want to see that you're not just another cog in the machine. They want to see that you help move the machine. How do you contribute to the greater goal? And of course, this applies outside of work as well. Schools like to see people who make something happen in their community. I call it being part of something bigger than yourself. So maybe you started a local coding boot camp for underserved students, or maybe you organized a fundraising initiative that brought in real dollars, even a small amount, for a cause that you care about. So it's impact that impresses admissions committees as opposed to titles or big name employers. And then when you talk about authenticity, this one is probably the hardest for candidates to grasp because they mess it up without even realizing it. And why does it happen? Because they fail to say how they actually bring a unique perspective to the table. They'll say something like, I believe an MBA will help me bridge the gap between business and technology. Or something like, they might say, growing up in a multicultural household shaped my worldview and leadership approach. And these statements might be true, and they may even be the foundation for a very strong story. But if you stop at that, it's not going to be enough because 1,000 other people can say the exact same thing. So let's talk about an example. Let's just say that a candidate says this in a first draft. I'm almost going to use myself as an example, but let's just say someone says, I have a strong work ethic because I learned from my immigrant parents. It's a really nice thought. Like, I'm an immigrant myself. I can relate to this. But at this level of detail, this story is still incredibly generic. So usually what I ask candidates is, what are some specific moments that show this? Can you drop me into a scene and tell me how the actual learning of these strong ethics happened? Because I am ready to bet money that your parents didn't sit you down and said, we are immigrants. Let's teach you some strong work ethic. And then when you push the candidates, they end up coming with much stronger stories with a little bit of work. But just imagine now that same story, but told a different way. Let's just imagine that the candidate now says, when I was 10, my parents ran a small restaurant. And one day, just before the night shift started, the dishwasher quit. And me and my siblings took shifts washing dishes so the restaurant doesn't close that night. I was 7 years old. I had to stand on a milk crate in the back because I was barely able to reach the sink, but I was determined to help. It's a very different statement, isn't it? I always call it drop the person in a scene that tells the story about you. And it doesn't have to be a heroic story, but everyone has a story like this in their background. It makes applications feel real. And that's what makes people stand out way beyond anything that has to do with numbers and statistics.
I love that you use the word scene, especially as it relates to storytelling, which can also be a bit of a buzzword in a whole bunch of industries. But when you break it down into a scene, that actually really makes it quite concrete.
Mm-hmm.
So these three pillars that you mentioned, is that what we call fit?
When it comes to school fit, this is where candidates kind of often get things wrong. They think that showing school fit means showing the school how much they love that school. And school fit isn't about just liking a school. It's about belonging there. I'm actually going to cite a colleague from one of the schools because she has great advice on their website about this. I'm talking about the Tuck School of Business. And I think it was Pat Harrison in their admissions office, which has a great piece right on the website that I so very often refer candidates to, where she says that loving Tuck is not the same as knowing Tuck. And I love to refer to that very often, regardless of what school candidates are applying to, because a lot of them think that they have to layer on thick the love for the school or almost like flatter their way into it. And it doesn't work this way. So, of course, candidates should check rankings first. They should check if the school has a strong program or concentration that meets their goals and global opportunities. But if you simply talk about rankings, or you have a finance program and you have a global opportunity, great, but that's not fit. That's kind of like repeating the marketing brochure back to the school. So when schools evaluate fit, they're very often asking themselves, do you truly understand what our school is about? Will you thrive here academically, but also socially and professionally? And can we picture you in our classroom, in our study group, in our alumni network someday? And the answer will be different for each school. And if you give an answer in your essay that can be copy-pasted into any other school, clearly you've missed the point. I can tell you one thing that happens very often. One of the biggest cliches I see in MBA applications is candidates saying something like, I'm drawn to school X because of its collaborative community. And saying you want collaboration is like saying that you enjoy breathing air. Every top business school values collaboration. So if you write that, admissions is going to think, cool, but what does that actually mean for you? But if instead you tell them how you personally thrive in this kind of settings, and you show them that this environment isn't just something you like, it's something that you need in order to succeed, all of a sudden it becomes very personal to you. So the point that I'm making here is that people should go below surface level fit. Like if someone says, I'm excited about Kellogg because of its focus on teamwork, I will push back and say, okay, but like why Kellogg specifically? How does Kellogg do teamwork differently than Michigan Ross or Team Fuqua, right? So you have to dig deeper.
Is this something that folks should be thinking about as they start the process, or when is the right time to be thinking about your story?
That's a really great question about the sequence of events and where do you start? So here's how I would suggest people go about it. At the beginning, they should be thinking about their MBA story without too much constraint, without worrying about mistakes. But eventually, they're going to want to go back and sort of make sure that they're not committing some of the big mistakes. And let's actually talk about like what happens, what constitutes a big mistake in an MBA application. One of the biggest ones that we're seeing nowadays is about career goals. Very often candidates simply say, well, I want to go from consulting into tech, and then they stop there. That's not a career goal. Tech is an industry category, and it tells the admissions committee nothing about what you actually want to do. So a strong career goal answers very specific questions. What role are you targeting? What kind of problems do you want to solve? And how does this connect to what you've already done before? So instead of I want to pivot into consulting, you might need to say something like, I plan to join a consulting firm, a healthcare practice of a consulting firm where I can leverage my experience in biotech operations to help pharmaceutical companies improve their go-to-market strategies for new drugs. And then in the long term, I want to transition into a chief strategy officer. And of course, that's just an example. A lot of candidates will actually be able to inject some personal motivation for why specifically pharmaceutical companies and go-to-market strategies. And they might talk about wanting to do that in emerging markets because maybe they come from an emerging market. So all of a sudden, you can see the difference from saying, I want to work in tech because it's dynamic and innovative, to actually having a purpose, having a vision for the kind of problems you want to solve. So the bottom line is that if your career goals are vague or generic, or you're not showing clearly that they're feasible for you, nowadays, schools are going to wonder if you really even know why you're applying. So that's a big one in terms of sort of putting guardrails and checking that you've done well and you've nailed your story.
How would you advise a candidate to start thinking more introspectively like that? For some people, that's really difficult. I mean, sometimes I don't even know what I want to eat for dinner, let alone know, like, what my ultimate career purpose is.
I wish that I could say that there's a very clear mind map where you start with this question and then you move to that question. But let's break it down a little bit. So to me, the overarching question that the strongest MBA candidates answer in one way or another is, what are my values and how have they driven my actions? Of course, this is a huge question. So a way for people to approach the process could be thinking about pivotal influences, pivotal moments. So most of us have had family, mentors, maybe bosses who've influenced our development and growth. We've learned something from them. So who are these people and what have you learned from them and how? Pivotal moments, usually choices that we've made. How did we choose our school, our first job, our second job? How did we choose to take this promotion or forgo it? And then moments when we've been part of something bigger than ourselves, as I was saying earlier. Because one thing that the MBA admissions process sometimes can instill in candidates, because it's so inherently competitive, people are sort of shining the spotlight on themselves a little too much, and they forget to think about how have you helped someone else? Because in the end, that's the definition of leadership, isn't it? So asking yourself a series of questions, doing it more than once, going several layers deep. So if you say that it was your immigrant parents who influenced you, ask yourself how or why several times. Don't stop at the first layer. Well, they influenced me because I witnessed this. Okay, and what else happened? Why was that actually a pivotal moment? I sometimes talk about 3 layers of why. Keep yourself asking why, because you're going to discover deeper insights. So the process is long. It's supposed to be long. It's iterative. Keep digging, keep experimenting. I've had instances where I'll work with a candidate and help guide them through creating a really strong essay on a highly, let's say, philosophical topic. A great example of this is the famous Stanford What Matters Most to You and Why essay. And I'll have a candidate who might finish that essay and be very satisfied with how the story presents. I'm very happy to read it because it truly paints them in great light. And then a week later, they might say, I actually have a different story in me. And I always encourage them to experiment because there's more than one way to answer a question. I very often caution people that they're not going to arrive at very clear answers early on. It's not expected to work this way, that they're going to go through a period, I call it the messy middle, where everything is going to feel like I have so many different threads and I don't know which one is valuable and I don't know which one is gold and I don't know which one to follow. But if you allow yourself the discomfort of being in the messy middle long enough, clarity always ensues. And clarity is a beautiful place to be.
So I'm kind of getting a sense that quality of experience maybe is better than the quantity of work experience. Is that true? Is that a myth?
That is so very true. Quality trumps quantity every single time. And people don't have to have a specific kind of background to belong in business school. It's not even how long you've worked. It's what you've done with that time. So let's just say a candidate who has maybe just 3 years of experience, but very high impact, could very well may end up being much more compelling than someone that did 6 or 7 or 8 years in pretty much the same role. But here's what the outcomes actually care about when they look at your work experience, however long it might be. So have you taken on increasing responsibility? And it doesn't have to be by title. I very often work with international candidates who might come from an industry or a company where promotions are not handed out every year on a schedule. So they worry, I've been in the same role for 5 years, but there's still progression that you can show. You don't need to have a manager in your title, but you need to show some growth, whether it's in scope, in leadership, in expertise. So let's just say that you've been in an analyst role for a while, but did you maybe move into more client-facing work? That's growth, that's progression. Or did you get put on higher stakes projects? That's growth. Or maybe if you're in a startup, you build something from the ground up. Or maybe your work helped support some key company decisions. So there's a way to look at your experience beyond simply numbers, titles. How did you help move things forward? I often ask candidates, how did you leave a place, an organization, or just a small group of people better than you found them? So show that you're not simply along for the ride. And again, if you dig deep enough, I guarantee you that every single person has substance. They very often simply don't put in enough effort to uncover that substance and present it.
What about folks who are maybe in their undergraduate and don't have formal work experience? Does internship experience count? Do school projects count?
Frankly, I tell people very often, they'll ask me, how will the admissions committee view X, like my internships? And my answer to this is, well, they're going to view it the way you frame it. So how you present the story is what really matters. And you have an opportunity. The MBA application is an opportunity for you to connect the dots, to tell the story of where your impact comes from. So absolutely, internships can count. Even for someone that's out of school, I'm immediately thinking of one of my most successful candidates from round one this year who ended up being admitted to nearly every M7 schools, as they call them, across the board. And even though she had been in the workforce for a few years, she actually referred back to some internships she did because they informed her short-term goals and the pivot that she wanted to make. So internships are completely valid. Working on the side, if you wish, for a family business can be a very meaningful experience. Everything where you've problem solved, put in effort towards a goal can be something that helps in your MBA application.
What about test scores? What role do they have in the story that you're telling? Are they major characters? Is it supporting cast?
So probably a little bit of both. Test scores are a measure of your academic preparedness, of your ability to handle the quantitative rigor of an MBA program. An MBA, needless to say, stands for a Master of Business Administration, and that means that you're going to be learning accounting, finance, statistics, lots of really quant-heavy subjects, and you need to be able to handle them. And sometimes people will say, well, but I'm a former engineer, and I know how to do quant, and I very often think of myself in this case. And I was a former engineer, and if there was one class as an MBA student that made me cry, not in class, it was outside of class, it was when I got my midterm actually, was finance. It was really, really hard. And I thought, I have a master's in engineering, I'm golden. So the test score is one of the first checks for, do you have the academic readiness, the preparedness for that? But in my experience, it goes even beyond that. And I very often talk to candidates that it's a signal for more than just academic preparedness. So if someone is applying to a very competitive program, if they take the test once and the test is kind of okay, but it's below the average for that program, and they submit that test, the school might ask themselves, are you aware of how competitive our MBA admissions process is? And are you putting in enough work to prepare yourself for it? So it has signaling power about your awareness of how competitive the process is. And even a little bit about your resilience. Did you just stop after you got your first score, even though it was not great? Or are you willing to put in more work because you understand that for the reward that you're seeking, which is to get into a highly competitive MBA program, you're not going to just stop at the first hurdle and say, oh, it's good enough. So the test scores are really, really important. And personally, people have different opinions about different parts of MBA admissions. And I'll very often be the first to say that there are a lot of things in MBA admission that are a matter of opinion. Some people will say that a great story can make up for mediocre statistics, such as test score and GPA. I don't believe that that's the case because they measure different things. Your story might talk about your leadership, your impact, but your story alone of how you help build something is not going to be a proof that you have the academic ability. That's where the undergraduate track record and your test scores play a role.
I'm very much on the side of take the test that you can perform the best in and showcases the skills that you want to showcase to an admissions committee, which leads me to the question about test waivers. I know that there's test waivers available for folks who have a lot of work experience, for example. There's test waivers for other reasons as well. Is a low to moderate test score better than not submitting a test at all?
I think it's going to depend on a couple of things. It's going to depend on what evidence the candidates have of their academic ability, because with or without a test, the schools are going to want to have comfort that this particular candidate can handle the academic portion of their MBA experience and is not going to struggle in the process. So that's going to be important no matter what. From there, whether or not waivers are a viable option will depend on whether the program that the person targets even offers them. As you know, not all programs do it. And whether or not the person truly cares about rankings a lot or not so much, because usually the highest ranked full-time MBA programs will require the test and they'll require a competitive score. It's almost like I probably should choose my words more carefully. It's not that they're going to require it. It's just that there are going to be plenty of people for them to select from, the selection that we talked about, with a really high score. So why would they'll have to have some very strong reason to select someone who doesn't have that great score. And then if a person is not terribly sensitive to rankings and is willing to be a little bit more open-minded, there's plenty of really wonderful MBA programs out there where you could absolutely be a successful candidate and a successful student with a waiver, but a little bit of research, a little bit of awareness of how it might work is really important. I have to say, for what it's worth, the last couple of admission cycles, especially at the top 15 to 25 programs, the cycle has been very, very competitive. MBA programs have seen an increase in applications, and waivers can put someone at a disadvantage. So it's also not a static answer, yes or no. It kind of depends on the competitive environment. The landscape changes.
Absolutely. And I know the landscape changes within the same application year too, like with round 1, round 2, and round 3. How does that factor into not just test scores, but also in just like when to apply?
When to apply, the big question. And I think that it comes down to a few things. MBA candidates very often get very surprised when I tell them how much smaller the pool of applications in round 1 is. They somehow think that it's like equally distributed. You get 50% in round 1, 50% in round 2, and then a small handful in round 3. Not at all. Round 1 can very often be a third or even a quarter of the overall volume of applications that the schools are going to get throughout that cycle. Why is that the case? Because not very few, but fewer people end up being ready to submit in round 1. Everyone has the intent, but then of course, sometimes they can't pull it together. So what ends up happening is round 1 is smaller, and people think, oh, well, that means that I have really stronger odds. But what ends up being the case is that it's small, but it comprises very well qualified candidates. The early starters, the early planners, the people who had their target test score a year in advance, and they're showing up really strong. So there's the volume of applications, but there's also the quality of these applications. It used to be the case years ago that in round 1, candidates were signaling to the school, I'm applying in round 1 because I'm really committed to you. And if you admit me, I'm very likely to come. That has changed over the years. Candidates' attitude and how they strategize around rounds has changed. And that signaling power of applying in round 1 is no longer strong or even exists. So there's no longer this advantage that round 1 provided from that standpoint. I find that equally strong candidates tend to have more or less equally strong odds, whether they apply in round 1 or round 2. So the strength of your application ends up being the thing that matters. Round 3 is a different ballgame. Again, there are caveats. If we're talking round 3 for US top 15 programs versus round 3 for very well-ranked European programs, sometimes the European programs tend to have more than 3 rounds even. So what a candidate would be very well served to do is understand these nuances, round 3 for the top US programs can be very problematic because by that point, most of the seats in the class are already taken with very strong candidates. So the schools will still consider a candidate. They're still going to read the application, evaluate it. But that person is going to have to be adding something to the class, something really that they want. And the reality is that some schools don't even have round 3. A few years ago, Harvard Business School eliminated round 3. They're kind of a little bit of an outlier when it comes to it, but it's a fact. So it's not like you can even plan for round 3. So again, it's an individual decision. I've seen people be successful in round 3, but they have to be thoughtful about it. What you don't want to happen in round 3 is show up with kind of like a Hail Mary application that's very clearly a product of a last-minute decision, hastily put together, doesn't show the level of intent, the level of thought that those who got admitted in rounds 1 and round 2 demonstrated, because that's not going to put the candidate in a winning position.
You mentioned starting early, and I think that early is different for a lot of different people. What is starting the application process early? Is that like 6 months ahead of time, a year ahead?
So I will say that my most successful candidates who end up getting a lot of options, so they're not simply sitting there hoping to be chosen, they end up getting chosen by multiple programs with very generous scholarship offers, usually start working with me 6 to 12 months in advance. This is not to say, I don't mean to scare people who might not be ready yet. I see some very strong candidates who can quickly do the work, who come to me a couple of months before the deadline. There are ways to still do the work. I've seen extreme outliers who do the work in several weeks. They are extreme outliers, people who are just incredibly capable of producing quickly, iterating. But I think that a very thoughtful time frame is 6 to 12 months before the application deadline. And that means that I usually tell people if they're thinking of round 1 this fall, so we're 6-ish months away from round 1, a little less than that. It usually starts in early September. I tell them that they better have their GMAT booked already, their first official sitting for next month, so April or sooner. And they're like, but why, Petia? Why? Like, why can't I just take it in June or July? And of course you can. But what ends up happening is when your first official sitting for the exam ends up being in June, what if you don't get that target score? What if you're really way off? Will you have enough runway to take it, to prepare meaningfully? You know very well that the number one factor that correlates with a stronger test score is, guess what? The amount of hours you put into preparing. What ends up happening is if you're dealing with this in June or even worse in July or August, it throws off the rest of your game because now you're nervous about that test score. So do you really have the time to be walking around asking yourself, what are my values and how have they driven my actions? Like, you're nervous about your test score. You're worried about your test prep. So giving yourself time, using a beautiful long runway, just gives you more peace of mind, the ability to experiment, the ability to course correct, to take the exam again and then again if you have to.
So let's say that whoever's listening has started early, they've secured their story, they've sat for the GMAT, or they have their registration booked. They kind of have an idea of how they want to answer essays from different schools. When does the interview happen?
One thing that candidates should know is that the process is very multi-layered and there are a lot of checks and balances. So especially at the very top MBA programs, your application is very often going to be read twice before an interview decision is made by 2 different people to ensure that there are no biases. They're going to be independent reads. So one is not going to see the notes of the other. They're going to have a clean slate reading. And in that initial read and review of your application, which is going to be fairly detailed, and in that initial read, the decision that's being made is, do we want to invite you for an interview? Do we want to give you a hearing and meet you? And then that's when the interview happens. You've passed the initial evaluation. You've been deemed sufficiently qualified. You're admissible. And now you're getting an interview invite. You're getting the ability to show up, to actually have your voice and presence in front of a member of the admissions committee or an evaluator and help them connect the dots even more and see who's this person who's going to show up in our class if we admit them as a student, as an alum, 3, 5, 10 years from now. So the interview is a very important point for those who've passed the initial evaluation and have been deemed admissible and potentially desirable. And now they're getting an additional data point. And then the file will go back for one more review, now with the interview notes added to the mix. And from there, there's going to be potentially a committee meeting where a very large group of candidates are being discussed. There's deliberation, there's back and forth, and some final decision making. The final decision making can be done in that committee meeting, kind of by consensus. Sometimes a very senior member of the admissions team, maybe the director themselves, might have the final say because they're sort of putting together that class, that magic mix of amazing people that's going to be their new class. But that's how the interview fits in the picture. And if it's going to be helpful to mention what schools are looking for in the interview, I would say that the most important things are, does the person who's showing up for the interview, does their voice and presence match what we saw in the application? Are they speaking the way they presented themselves in the application? Are they saying the same things? Is the story that they're presenting in speaking really the same story that they told us in their application? And then, of course, interpersonal and communication skills. Can we see this person be a successful student, be a great teammate to the rest of our students, be a great carrier of the brand, if you wish, someone who is truly going to exemplify our mission?
What are they not looking for in an interview?
What they're not looking for is, they're not looking for a presentation of who you are. They're looking for a conversation with you that helps them understand who you are. So very often what I see candidates do out of a desire to present this perfect candidate facade is overly rehearse, have a specific set of talking points that they want to make sure they get across, regardless of what the questions are. So I guess you can summarize it by saying, don't try to impose your own agenda. Take the lead of the interviewer. Know yourself. All of the questions that you're going to be asked are going to be about you. And you are a subject you should know well. They're not going to ask you something that has literally zero connection to you. Even if you get asked in some of the tough there are certain interviews that are very famous for being tough, where you might be asked about your industry or something that relates to your business model, but still what the interviewer wants to know is how you think about the types of questions that are being brought up. They're not looking for a certain specific answer. They want to hear how you think, how you make decisions, how you formulate your thoughts. So when people reframe their thinking about the interview to understand, oh yeah, it's true, all of the questions are going to be about me. So instead of thinking that there's a very specific, narrowly defined answer I should give, I'm just going to think and talk my way through the answer using my actual substance, using my experiences, using the things that I've already done. They end up doing really, really well. When I do interview prep with my candidates, the goal for them is to see that they can answer any question, because in every prep, I'll throw different questions that we haven't prepared for, and they'll see that you can very quickly build the muscle and be able to talk about them. So they end up going to the interview excited to tell their story. What a beautiful place to be when you're going for your interview instead of anxious.
Yeah. Well, anxiety can be helpful too. It can be something that's very motivating, or it can be a reminder of, hey, I'm anxious about something. So that probably means I care about it.
High stakes situation.
It is a very high stakes situation, but it's only high stakes because it's important to you. And I think that's a really helpful reminder, at least for me, when I'm in a situation where I'm really nervous, or when I think back to when I was applying to business school. It was a great thing for me to acknowledge that I'm feeling really anxious, but I'm only feeling anxious because this is really important to me.
And I think it's also important to remember the person across from you who's interviewing you wants you to succeed. No one wants to see someone who's like flailing. The purpose is not to flunk you. They want to see what's been your best day under the sun. So it's important for us to remember and keep that perspective. When I said earlier in my introduction that I joke sometimes that I'm a gatekeeper turned gate opener, the reality is that I actually consider the majority of admissions leaders to be gate openers. They're rooting for you. They want you to succeed. This is not the same as saying they're going to admit everyone. They can't. It's not possible. But they're not looking for reasons to trick you, trip you, catch you doing something wrong. They're truly giving you an opportunity to tell your story.
Can you be too prepared for the application process, or can you be too qualified for an MBA?
Can you be too qualified for an MBA? If you have reasons to believe that there are certain skills or experiences that you don't have enough of or don't have them at all, then chances are an MBA can help. You might have to be thoughtful about what type of MBA is helpful to you. For some people, it may end up being an executive MBA. If a person is very experienced, they're not looking for business fundamentals. They're looking for much more advanced executive leadership training, if you wish, and exposure. I mean, Zach, I've drunk the Kool-Aid. So I'm a big believer in the power of an MBA. I believe that the skills and knowledge that it imparts in MBA candidates is always valuable. It's always useful. But of course, you need to know what you are looking for. So it always starts with the why. Remember how we talked about the 3 whys earlier, sort of like why an MBA, why now, why this school? If you have good answers to these questions, you're not going to be overly qualified. I mean, I've worked with some people even back in my day as Dean of MBA Admissions who've been already very, very established in leadership positions or in their career, but they had a reason to want to learn and acquire new skills, new knowledge, new experiences. So if you have clarity about your why, it's not likely that you're going to be overqualified.
What is the one thing that you wish every applicant knew before applying? And you've mentioned so many helpful things like knowing your story, knowing why, when to start. But if you had to pick one, Petia, what's the one thing that you wish every applicant knew?
I love that you're asking me this question, Zach, because we really threw a lot around in this conversation, didn't we? And I suspect that if MBA candidates are listening, which they are, this whole conversation might feel almost a little overwhelming. They might think like, this sounds like a lot. Am I doing enough? Is my story strong enough? What if I haven't booked my test, as Petia suggests, in April? Or what if I'm not ready to begin that soul searching? But the thing that I want MBA hopefuls to know is, first, every single candidate that I've worked with has had a great story. Every single one. There isn't a person who's an MBA candidate who doesn't have a great story. So sometimes you just need to dig, and sometimes you might need someone to help shine a bright light on it. And then the second thing that I want them to know, and I alluded to it a little bit, is that the process is not a rigid puzzle. You don't have to have specific pieces. You don't need to have a perfect score. You don't need to have a brand name employer on your resume. The process is an opportunity to reflect, to understand yourself more deeply, to figure out what truly drives you. So my parting advice is for candidates to approach the process with curiosity and a sense of possibility. Because if you do that, you're not just putting together an MBA application, you're actually taking the first step to building the kind of future you want. So curiosity and a sense of possibility is what I want our listeners to walk away with.
I can't think of a better place to end. Thank you, Petia, so much for joining us on the podcast.
Absolutely my pleasure. MBA admissions is what I love most and know best. So always happy to talk about it.
If there's one thing that's crystal clear, it's that your application is so much more than a collection of numbers and list of achievements. Each of you listening has a unique story, a journey that can't be captured by a GPA or a test score. It's the passion behind your accomplishments, the resilience in your challenges, and the vision that drives you forward. Those are the intangibles that Petia talked about. Those are the elements that can transform an application from good to unforgettable. For those of you preparing to apply to business school, take a moment and step back from the spreadsheets, from the study guides, for now at least, and reflect on your personal narrative. What makes you uniquely you? How have your experiences shaped your aspirations? Those are the stories that admissions committees are waiting to hear. If you want more insights from Petia, you can find her at mymbapath.com. And for more resources on the GMAT and business school admissions, visit mba.com. I'm Zach at GMAC, and this has been Inside the GMAT.